Some may have noticed that I've had HBM APU wait on my whiteboard for, honestly, probably half a year at this point. The truth is, I've had this plan to look at some maybe lesser noticed factors that go into a lot of the APUs we've been talking about over the past few years for a while now. But with all of the Ampere, RDNA 2, PlayStation, Xbox, and Intel news, I just haven't had time to get to it until now. But now is 2021, and at the start of this new year, well, I think we're going to see a launch of a flurry of APUs. That's something I've been talking about for quite a while, that 2021 could be the year of APUs. I really do feel that when it comes to the desktop, it's just about waiting for anything to hopefully come in stock. But what's hoping to be coming in stock, Ampere, Zen 3, and other products, I mean, maybe with the exception of Rocket Lake, which is about to come out, that's about it. That's about what you should expect to get on desktop in a meaningful way this year. So really the interesting stuff will be APUs, and I won't claim to be an expert on APUs or their design or really anything. I don't claim to be an expert on anything, honestly. But I did recently, as of when this now multi-month-old script was started, go down a rabbit hole of APU history research. I've always found them fascinating, and I really wanted to look into if I could construct an argument for why we haven't seen GDDR5 or HBM on almost any APU, certainly none of the mainstream do-it-yourself ones. You see, when I went down the AMD APU history rabbit hole, I went in with the mindset of, well, I mean, let's be honest, guys. It's not just a mindset, it's the truth. AMD would have thought of putting HBM and GDDR5 on some of their APU chips. I mean, they've done it in a sort of pseudo way with the Kaby Lake G integration with Intel. There are consoles and, I mean, I guess you would say console PC hybrids that have been sold in other markets that have GDDR5 controllers on them. This isn't something AMD hasn't thought to do. So there must be a reason they're not doing this. And as I looked through really all APUs that were from Llano till now, I did notice a pretty compelling set of arguments you can make for why maybe integrating on-die memory doesn't always make as much sense as you would think. It's not that simple. And really, before I get into the details, I think something everyone needs to keep in the back of their head here is that, well, we tend to focus on flagship products when it's any die. We're talking about GA102 for Ampere. You're probably most likely to obsess over the 3090 or eventually the Titan, or at the very least right now, A6000, the full die. A lot of people gush over the 6900 XT, but the majority of the sales are going to be the 6800 and the 6800 XT. Most products either get cut down or binned to lower clocks than the theoretical top golden chips. And so you've got to think about that when you consider if it's really worth the extra expenses and limited space you have to make an APU to integrate memory for more bandwidth. Every APU generation is a product stack, not just the top golden chip. Now, having said that, bandwidth is very important. I mean, this is something I've harped about dozens of times. I remember first being kind of a little annoyed with how people disregarded overclocking memory on graphics cards, all the way back to the 7970, where I was able to clock my 7970's memory from, I believe it was 1375 megahertz to above 1800 megahertz. And even just doing that, not even touching the core clocks, I was able to net at least 10 to 15% more performance from about a 30 to 40% bandwidth increase. It was about half of the performance increase I got when I overclocked both the core and the memory, and I was really annoyed that so many people seem to think bandwidth doesn't help. Bandwidth does help. Bandwidth is one of the main bottlenecks to performance when you look at integrated graphics, well, any graphics that you use to play games. But the truth is that there is always some bottleneck in any product, and that if most of the stack won't be the top product, it might not always be worth bolting on the extra bandwidth I see so many people begging AMD to do in the comments. So actually, yeah, let's start getting into this. Let's start with what is largely considered the first real APU generation Llano from AMD, all the way back from 2011. I remember when this launched, if you can believe it. And even though I'm saying you shouldn't focus on just the top chip, I will to make an example. So you have 400 stream processors, and that's basically similar to the desktop card, the 5670, that also had 400. And it had GDDR5. Now, this is when people will go, oh, so, but that had GDDR5. Look how bandwidth starved it is. Yes, it has 400 stream processors, just like the desktop card. And yes, the desktop card with 64 gigabytes per second of bandwidth has over double what you would see in this if you used 1866 megahertz memory. But you also have to consider that this is clocked about almost 23% lower than that 5670. And then you've got to consider this. About 2/3 of this lineup does not have the full 400 stream processors. This is a lineup AMD was designing around, not just the top golden samples with top binning. And if you look at that, well, this is actually closer to a 5570, and well, that card used GDDR3, not GDDR5. It actually had about half the bandwidth of 1866 DDR3, and even less than 1600, which was the standard at the time. So at the end of the day, what you can say is the majority of this APU lineup probably actually had more than enough bandwidth. And yes, the very top product had less, but when you're AMD, you're not designing for the golden samples. You're designing for an entire lineup that has to be cost effective with many constraints. And that pretty much covers it for the first lines of AMD APUs. I'm not going to dwell on every single little iteration that came after that. I think I made it pretty obvious that, in fact, a large part of the first APUs out of AMD were less bandwidth starved than a lot of their equivalent desktop cards. So let's just skip ahead. I'm going to skip ahead to Kaveri, an APU that I know for sure so many people said was bandwidth starved at the time, and including me in the forums. And so let's just go right into not one of those older, Radeon architecture-based APUs, but one that used GCN, one that right out of the gate seemed incredibly bandwidth starved. Why wouldn't AMD have integrated at least a single chip of GDDR5 or something on the die? Indeed, the 7850K in 2014, remember the higher tiered ones came years later as really, honestly boring refreshes while AMD was treading water before Zen launched. This is the real one. This was the top chip that launched when it was relevant. The 7850K had 512 GCN cores, and yeah, so this was actually quite a bit powerful in theory for the time. It was basically a 7750, except really handicapped by bandwidth. And look, it was, but how handicapped was it really? You'd probably think a ton, but and it did take me some effort to dig this up, if we actually compare DDR3 versus GDDR5, with the 7730, but what was the difference? Honestly, about 10 to 30%. 10 to 30% was the difference between over doubling the bandwidth with the DDR3 version. And keep in mind, the DDR3 versions of these graphics cards typically used slow DDR3 as well. You could use faster if you got this APU. And that was with the 384 CU model. Most of the lineup is 384 or lower, and the difference in performance by going with DDR3 instead of integrating GDDR5, 10 to 30%. I mean, it's clocked lower than the desktop chips as well. So it would have probably been about a 10 to 20% difference. And yeah, a 10 to 20% performance boost seems like a big deal, especially now with how expensive performance increases are becoming for graphics cards. But remember that right now GDDR5 is over a decade old. It's like $5 or less a gigabyte. Back then it was over $10 a gigabyte. And so think about what I'm saying here. So you take this APU that's going to most likely be sold for less than $150 for the majority of the lineup, the overwhelming majority of the lineup, and you're like, we're going to increase the cost by 10 to 20% to add 10 to 20% performance for the chips that use GDDR5, but that's just the chips that use it. Most of the lineup doesn't even really need it. And so we're just wiping out a large portion of the die space. I have a little diagram I put together here. That's a roughly measured out estimate of how much space one GDDR5 chip would have taken up if you just threw it onto Kaveri. And if you do, look at that. That's a significant portion of the die. Basically, you're saying instead of 512 stream processors, we're probably going to have to make do with like 256 because you need to remove space from just the compute units, and you also need the GDDR5 memory controller on there, maybe even more. So there's really no argument for doing this overall, right? Only the top chips need it, and the top chips are now going to have less compute units. You're probably going to add 10% more performance while adding 20% more cost, and the majority of the lineup doesn't need it. I mean, heck, even if you would have made some space on the packaging for a larger die for the memory controller to try to get as many compute units as, I mean, you're just ballooning the cost more and more, adding complexity to the design. You're going from a $150 chip to probably what would have ended up being a $250 chip, and you only increase the performance of the very top yields by 30 to 50%. I'm saying 30 to 50% after you've made it bigger so you can still fit as many compute units. And then you have to ask yourself this, is there even really a market for that? Are there people looking to spend $250 at the time for an integrated graphics this powerful when, well, some of those chips I showed you, like the 5670 and then the 6670, the 7750, these were like sub $100 graphics cards. Those are the good old days when those still existed. So people could just buy that and add it to a much cheaper CPU. It just didn't make sense back then. However, I do think such a strategy for a top-end gaming APU will make sense soon, and I'd like to talk about it. But first, an ad from a sponsor. Though it may be cold outside, we're staying warm through the flames of knowledge provided by Skillshare. Yes, I'm proud to say that Skillshare is a sponsor of this video. Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of inspiring classes for creative and curious people that allows its members to explore new skills, deepen existing passions, and get lost in creativity. It's curated specifically for learning, meaning there are no ads, and they're always launching new premium classes so you can stay focused and follow wherever your creativity takes you. From classes that introduce members to animation to broad subjects like managing daily productivity, Skillshare has what you need to make this year a year that you grow. In fact, one course I think a lot of people could benefit from is Storytelling for Leaders with Keith Yamashita. Whether you realize it or not, anything you communicate in long form is deep down a story, and he teaches you how to tell a good one. If you feel a burning passion to learn, then use Skillshare because it is very affordable. It's less than $10 a month for an annual subscription, and the first 1,000 people to use the link on screen and in my description will get a free trial of Skillshare Premium membership. Sign up for Skillshare today, a wonderful resource for learning. All right, you were good. You get your treat now. You know, there have been little experiments like Kaby Lake G, where they had a Vega GH or GL graphics card with HBM on it integrated with an Intel quad-core processor. And yeah, it was really impressive overall, but most laptops were not built to use the extra space. And so this highly integrated HBM-laden APU-like product, the Kaby Lake G lineup, just ended up competing with laptops that had a 1050 Ti and a quad core on its own, and those usually cost less because you'd have to put expensive HBM in there. This is the truth of the matter, that because there's always been these bargain bin graphics cards that can spread out the heat by not having to be integrated in one package with the processor, can just be cheaper. It's just a cheaper solution that's always been there. Well, really up until now, though. You see, that's the thing. That's where I get to one of the main points of this video. I hope you see what I've been saying, right? I think there's just been a lot of consistent reasons here and there why we haven't seen APUs with GDDR5 or HBM or what have you integrated on the die. Either the cores themselves really didn't need the bandwidth, or most of the lineup couldn't make use of it, or it just costs too much for the performance you would get. Even a 50% performance increase really isn't worth it in an APU that would double in cost, and most people don't buy APUs for that. But now the low end of the graphics market is kind of dying. If you look around prices on Newegg or even used cards on eBay, you can see how it just doesn't seem like these things exist anymore. I mean, 60s, like the 1060 launched for $300, and before that, the 960 was $200. And now we're talking about $400 3060 Ti's. Like it is getting to the point where the 3050 Ti, the 50 Ti's from Nvidia used to be 150 or lower, often 120, is probably going to be $250 for a 6 GB graphics card. A lot of this is due to increased wafer costs, to be fair, but it's also due to just the market's prices just naturally going up as people show they're willing to pay more. And that does leave an opening for competitive high-performance APUs, I think. I think it does. And people who've been following my channel for a while will know that I've been hyping up the potential of APUs for a while now, although I've certainly mismatched some of the code names with rumored specs that are out there, and, well, I mean, yeah, even though the AMD hasn't reached the full potential of what they could be releasing now, that's the point of this video, telling you why they haven't. But I do really want to drill in on why it will make much more sense to put out much higher performing APUs soon, and really that's margins. The fact is AMD is done being the budget brand. I suspect that they will continue to price their cards lower than the Nvidia equivalents for the foreseeable future, but not that much less. They want to stay above 50% margins, and so if you're trying to sell a graphics card for under $200, I'm not really sure how you do that at all when a wafer is going to be 17 grand, and they're always trying to get on TSMC's cutting edge nodes, or really I think TSMC is trying to force them onto them. And so with that in mind, these used to be 5,000, now they're 17,000. I don't know how you make a $100 graphics card there anymore. But with a highly integrated APU that makes do with less and doesn't need to come with a cooler, something where someone will already have a cooler and they can just slot this in, I think that's the place where we will finally see higher performing APUs. People would say Cezanne may even already be this, or maybe Van Gogh. And as far as I'm aware, you shouldn't double down on Van Gogh being canceled, by the way. I know some people have been saying that, although it's neither here nor there. The funny thing is, even if Cezanne and Van Gogh in their own rights, and they are different APUs in multiple ways as I've explained in the past, are powerful at gaming relative to Renoir, as far as we know, they have no plans to support anything but regular old DDR4, and even Rembrandt coming after these APUs, well, that's coming out right around when DDR5's hitting AM5, and that should be more than enough for something twice as powerful as that. So even for the foreseeable future, the factors I've talked about are pushing against integrating memory. This will be an important entry-level gaming segment, high-powered APUs with integrated memory in the next 3 to 4 years. But it might still not be this year. I mean, Cezanne isn't going to really need anything more than the up to 5,000 megahertz DDR4 that's on the market now. And what comes after Cezanne will be able to use DDR5, which will be above 5,000 megahertz. So even with like 24 compute units of RDNA 2 or RDNA 3, I'm not sure there will be that much of a bottleneck. There's still that balance of, is it really worth adding that much more cost for this much more performance when that's not really what this segment is for? Probably not even this year. But I think it will be in the next few years, especially when it comes to professional APUs, because when I talk to people in the server industry, they are begging for these things to exist, especially with how sensitive to latency so many server applications are and how much they're willing to pay for simplicity. When you have one big like server APU, you wouldn't have to worry about all these extra power connectors for separate graphics cards and separate slots. You can just make the whole rack thinner and have one cooling solution for the entire package that's graphics and processor. So yeah, I think that's going to come to servers first. That is something AMD's publicly said they're working on, but it's not going to come to consumers until you get that perfect balance of bandwidth, cost, and what the entire product stack needs. Most people don't buy the top product. Most of them are cut down. Do they actually need that much bandwidth? Chip design is trade-offs. Anyone can just make a big fat thing that uses a ton of energy. But the majority of products actually sold to customers have a ton of constraints: cost, heat, how much space you actually have to build this, and if there's even really a market for maximizing all of those at the same time for an added cost. At least up until now, AMD has thought it hasn't been worth it. It's not that they didn't think about adding HBM or GDDR5. They have done that on some specialized APUs used on, actually, that run Windows on some products in China, or of course the consoles like the Xbox and PlayStations. This is something that makes sense in specific use cases, but when it comes to the do-it-yourself market and even laptops, it really hasn't made that much sense up until now, but it probably will eventually. Just not yet, maybe not even this year. All right, so yeah, that's one more video crossed off that was in the backlog of videos to do from 2020, and there are far more to do in the first half of this year as well. I know you guys have been pointing out a lot of the other ones that have been up on there, and I'll get to the ones that I think make sense to get to. But otherwise, yeah, more videos coming in this new year, 2021. But I do want to take a second to say something here. Just like the December of 2019, in December of 2020, this past month, well, me, Dan Gerard, the entire team tried to spend some time with our families, tried to take some time off, and that's why it was predominantly podcasts. You know, we do need a breather while we pump out twice as many videos as most independent tech channels over an entire year. But additionally, I just want to say that there really hasn't been much news over the past month. 3060, 12 gigabyte, 3080 Ti, 3080 Super, whatever you're going to call it, the 20 gigabyte version of GA102. We've been doing videos about that months ago. I'm not just going to regurgitate the same crap, and I'm not just going to pretend I'm mad at AMD or NVIDIA over the same bullshit just so I can poop out a video every day that's really talking about nothing. I mean, if you just say the same things over and over, eventually I'm not really sure what you're doing. So that's why there's always a broken silicon every week, to make sure we cover the news and bring in outside voices. But sometimes there's not a need to manufacture something to talk about. We talk when we feel we have something to say that other people haven't said. I don't feel like there's ever been this, retrospective look at why it's been taking so long to get the HBM or GDDR laden APUs everyone's begging for in the YouTube comments. That's why we did this video, and that's why we do all videos. So just wanted to be clear about that. Broken silicon is the main piece of content for this channel, and it has always been. Always, guys. And it always probably will be. And you do get it early and ad-free if you support us on Patreon, which is really the focus of this year's growth goals. To have the content at the clip rate we had near the end of last year, where there were multiple videos every week, we've got to hire some people, because otherwise I'm going to burn out. So just please keep that in mind. And please remember that you get exclusive podcasts if you support us. The next one will be really a intimate discussion with the fans, looking at what you guys want out of this platform over the next year. That is where you will interact with us in that Die Shrink episode. So look for that if you want to. And otherwise, thank you for all of those who watch. Thank you for all of those who watch all of our content. Thank you to those who share our content. And thank you for those who even give us a glance. Thank you for watching.